Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back more than 3,000 years to a place where the sun rose over golden deserts, massive stone temples, and a river so important that an entire civilization organized its life around the rhythm of its floods. Ancient Egypt is usually remembered as a land of order. Perfect pyramids. Carefully carved hieroglyphs. Silent statues staring calmly into eternity. But when you look closer, when you step beyond the polished monuments and the tourist postcards, something much more interesting appears. Because behind the temples, behind the rituals, and behind the official image of perfect divine kingship, ancient Egypt was run by human beings. Very powerful human beings. Human beings who sometimes made strange choices. Human beings who occasionally ignored tradition completely. And human beings who, every once in a while, made their entire civilization collectively pause and say, "Wait, are we sure this is a good idea?" Tonight, we're going to meet several of those rulers. Pharaohs who were brilliant. Pharaohs who were strange. Pharaohs who ruled for so long that their people probably forgot what a different king even looked like. And pharaohs who quietly, or not so quietly, reshaped the entire culture around them. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan so there's a soft background hum. And settle in as we drift slowly into the long, complicated, occasionally awkward world of ancient Egyptian royalty. Because the story begins with a ruler who didn't just change Egypt. He emotionally confused it. His name was Akhenaten. Now, before Akhenaten appeared on the throne, Egyptian kings followed a fairly strict image policy. Pharaohs were not supposed to look like ordinary people. They were supposed to look perfect. Strong. Athletic. Calm. Timeless. If you look at statues of earlier rulers, you'll notice something interesting. They rarely show emotion. They stare straight ahead. Their faces are smooth and controlled. Their bodies are muscular and idealized. Basically, they look like divine gym instructors carved out of stone. This wasn't accidental. It was propaganda. Pharaohs were considered living gods. And gods, traditionally, do not lounge around cuddling their families in public artwork. But then Akhenaten arrived, and apparently decided that centuries of royal tradition were more like casual suggestions. Almost immediately after becoming king, he began changing things. Slowly at first. Then very dramatically. Most famously, he changed religion. For thousands of years Egypt had worshipped many gods. Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus. A complex divine family that governed every aspect of the universe. Akhenaten simplified this system drastically. He focused worship on a single solar deity known as Aten. And while historians still debate whether this was true monotheism or just extreme solar favoritism, one thing is clear. It was a massive shift. Temples were closed. Old religious traditions were pushed aside. New temples dedicated to the sun disk appeared across the land. But the religious change wasn't the only thing that surprised people. The art changed too. And this is where things became very noticeable. Under Akhenaten, Egyptian artists suddenly began depicting the royal family in ways that had never appeared before. Instead of rigid statues and formal poses, the king appeared in relaxed domestic scenes. He sat beside his queen, Nefertiti. They touched each other's faces. They held hands. They played with their daughters. Sometimes the royal children were shown climbing on their parents' laps or reaching up for kisses. To modern eyes, these scenes look surprisingly normal. Sweet, even. But to ancient Egyptians, this was extremely unusual. Because pharaohs were supposed to feel distant. Unreachable. Divine. Seeing the king behave like an affectionate parent in huge public carvings must have been a little confusing. Imagine walking into a temple expecting intimidating divine imagery and instead seeing what looks suspiciously like a family picnic carved into the wall. And then there was Akhenaten's appearance. If you've ever seen statues of him, you may have noticed that he doesn't look like other pharaohs. Earlier kings were built like athletes. Akhenaten looks different. He is often depicted with a long face, narrow shoulders, wide hips, and elongated limbs. His body appears almost androgynous. Scholars have debated this endlessly. Some believe it was symbolic religious imagery. Others think it represented artistic experimentation. A few have proposed medical explanations. But whatever the reason, the result was striking. Standing next to earlier pharaoh statues, Akhenaten looks like someone from a completely different artistic universe. And while modern historians calmly analyze these changes in academic papers, it's worth remembering that ordinary Egyptians were just living through it. One year everything looks traditional. The next year the king has redesigned religion, changed art styles, and is publicly displaying family affection on temple walls. That kind of transformation doesn't happen quietly. People notice. They whisper. Temple priests grumble. Artists adjust their chisels nervously. And somewhere in the palace, Akhenaten continues calmly ordering even more unusual artwork. Because once you start rewriting centuries of tradition, there's really no point stopping halfway. Now, while Akhenaten confused Egypt by changing its rules, another pharaoh would later overwhelm Egypt simply by existing for a very long time. His name was Ramesses II. And if Akhenaten was Egypt's experimental philosopher king, Ramesses was Egypt's unstoppable overachiever. Ramesses II ruled for about 66 years. To put that into perspective, that means several generations of Egyptians were born, grew up, and became adults under the same king. Imagine living your entire life knowing only one ruler. That kind of stability can feel reassuring. But it can also give a king a lot of time to expand his ambitions. Ramesses built temples. Huge ones. He carved his face into mountains. He erected statues so enormous that modern visitors still feel tiny standing beside them. If ancient Egypt had a national hobby, Ramesses turned it into monumental architecture. But monuments weren't the only thing he produced in large quantities. Ramesses also had an extremely large royal family. Historians estimate that he fathered more than 100 children. Yes. More than 100. At that point, the royal family tree begins to look less like a tree and more like an entire forest. Palace records list dozens of princes and princesses. Some would become important officials. Others disappear quietly into the background of history. And the palace itself had to expand constantly to accommodate this growing population of royal relatives. Yet despite this overwhelming scale, Ramesses remained enormously popular. Why? Because he was successful. He fought wars. He negotiated treaties. He kept Egypt stable. When a king provides security and prosperity, societies tend to become very forgiving of his energetic lifestyle. And so Ramesses ruled. And ruled. And ruled. Until eventually Egypt probably started wondering whether the man planned to retire from existence at all. But if ruling for decades makes one kind of legend, ruling for nearly a lifetime creates an entirely different one. Which brings us to another fascinating figure. Pepi II. Pepi II became king as a child. A very young child. And then he simply stayed king. For an incredibly long time. Some estimates suggest he ruled for over 90 years. Think about that for a moment. A ruler who begins as a child and remains on the throne long enough to outlive nearly everyone who originally served him. Courtiers. Advisors. Generals. Entire generations of officials. All replaced over time while the same king continues sitting on the throne. And when a ruler stays in power that long, something interesting happens. Stories start to accumulate. Rumors appear. Legends grow. Because eventually, no one alive remembers the beginning of the reign anymore. All they know is that Pepi II has always been king. And when a court becomes bored, it starts talking. Because when a king rules long enough, something subtle begins to happen inside a royal court. At first everything feels stable. The same palace halls echo with the same footsteps. The same officials carry out the same rituals. The same ceremonies repeat year after year under the same ruler. But time does not stop for anyone, not even a living god sitting on a golden throne. Courtiers grow old. Advisors retire or quietly disappear from records. Generals who once commanded armies are replaced by younger officers who only know stories about the early years of the king's reign. And gradually the court begins to feel like a place where history itself is piling up in layers. This was the world of Pepi II. He came to power as a small child. In the early years, powerful officials and royal relatives likely handled most of the real governing, while the young king grew up surrounded by tutors, priests, and palace attendants who carefully shaped his image as a divine ruler. That part was normal. Child kings were rare, but not unheard of. What was unusual was simply how long Pepi stayed on the throne. Decades passed. Then more decades. And eventually the reign stretched so long that historians today still debate whether it might be the longest rule of any monarch in recorded history. But long reigns have strange side effects. One of them is political fatigue. When a government operates under the same ruler for many decades, institutions slowly shift. Power spreads outward. Regional governors gain more influence. Local officials become more independent. Not necessarily out of rebellion, but simply because the machinery of the state begins to run on habit rather than constant royal oversight. Egypt during Pepi II's later years appears to have experienced exactly that. The central government weakened. Local leaders gained authority. And while the king himself remained an almost sacred symbol, the structure holding the kingdom together slowly loosened. To the people living at the time, this probably didn't feel like a dramatic collapse. It likely felt gradual. Subtle. The kind of slow change that only becomes obvious when historians look back centuries later. But Pepi II's reign also produced another kind of legacy, stories. Because when a ruler stays on the throne long enough, rumors grow like vines around the palace walls. Ancient texts written after his reign hint at strange anecdotes. Tales of royal whims. Stories of eccentric behavior. Some may have been exaggerated by later writers. Others may contain small pieces of truth hidden inside layers of gossip. One famous story claims that Pepi II enjoyed watching a particular official whose dark skin contrasted dramatically with white clothing during nighttime boat rides. Another tale suggests unusual court rituals and odd personal habits. Historians debate how accurate these accounts really are. Ancient writers often enjoyed dramatizing the past, especially when describing rulers from earlier generations. But even exaggerated stories tell us something important. They reveal how later Egyptians remembered Pepi II. Not just as a king, but as a king who ruled so long that his reign became surrounded by legend. And legend, once attached to a ruler's name, rarely disappears. Now while Pepi II's long reign slowly blurred the edges of Egypt's political structure, another pharaoh would challenge Egyptian tradition in a completely different way. This time not through longevity, but through identity. Her name was Hatshepsut. And her rise to power was unusual. Egypt had queens before. Powerful queens. Influential queens. But the title of pharaoh, the full, official role of divine king, was almost always held by a man. The entire system of royal imagery was designed around that expectation. Pharaohs wore specific crowns. They carried ceremonial beards. They were portrayed in masculine poses symbolizing strength and divine authority. Hatshepsut, however, inherited a political situation that allowed her to step into that role. At first she ruled as a regent for a young king, her stepson, the future pharaoh Thutmose III. Regencies were fairly common. An adult royal guiding the kingdom while a child king matured. But something interesting happened during this arrangement. Hatshepsut didn't step aside. Instead, she gradually assumed the full identity of Pharaoh. And the way she did it was fascinating. Rather than rejecting royal symbolism, she adopted it completely. Statues of Hatshepsut show her wearing the traditional royal headdress, the ceremonial beard, the posture of a male king. In some inscriptions she is even described using masculine grammatical forms. This wasn't necessarily deception. It was political strategy. The role of pharaoh had been built around male imagery for centuries. So Hatshepsut stepped into that framework and used it. To modern observers it can look strange. A female ruler portrayed with a stylized beard. But to ancient Egyptians, the symbolism probably mattered more than the biological detail. Pharaoh was not just a person. Pharaoh was an office. A cosmic role connecting the gods and the world of humans. And Hatshepsut proved extremely capable in that role. Her reign was peaceful. Trade expeditions expanded Egypt's wealth. One famous voyage traveled to the distant land of Punt, bringing back exotic goods, incense trees, and rare animals. Her building projects were ambitious. Temples rose along the Nile, including her spectacular mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. A structure so elegant that it still feels modern even after thousands of years. In many ways, Hatshepsut's rule was remarkably successful. But success in royal politics does not always guarantee lasting approval. After her death, something curious happened. Many of her statues were damaged or removed. Her name was erased from some monuments. Later rulers, possibly including Thutmose III himself, seem to have tried to minimize her presence in the official historical record. Historians debate why. Some believe it was political rivalry. Others think it was an attempt to restore the traditional image of male kingship. Whatever the reason, Hatshepsut's memory was partially hidden for centuries. Ironically, that attempt at erasure only made modern historians more fascinated with her story. Because when pieces of history disappear, researchers become determined to find them again. And gradually, statue fragments, inscriptions, and archaeological discoveries revealed the truth. A woman had ruled Egypt as pharaoh. Successfully. Confidently. And in a way that quietly challenged one of the most rigid traditions of the ancient world. But if Hatshepsut bent tradition carefully, another ruler would later shatter expectations in a completely different way. Not through gender. Not through longevity. But through spectacle. Because eventually we arrive at the reign of one of the most famous names in all of Egyptian history. A ruler whose story became so legendary that even people who know very little about ancient Egypt recognize the name. That ruler was Tutankhamun. And interestingly, his fame has almost nothing to do with what he accomplished during his lifetime. In fact, during his reign, Tutankhamun was relatively minor. He became king as a child, much like Pepi II had centuries earlier. And during those early years, powerful advisors and priests likely controlled most of the political decisions. One of the main tasks of Tutankhamun's government was repairing the chaos left behind by Akhenaten's religious revolution. Temples dedicated to traditional gods were restored. Old rituals returned. The royal court attempted to stabilize a country that had recently experienced radical change. In many ways, Tutankhamun's reign was about restoration rather than innovation. But fate had something unusual planned for his legacy. Because Tutankhamun died very young. Probably in his late teens. And after his death, he was buried in a royal tomb that, by the standards of pharaohs, was relatively small. Nothing about the burial suggested that thousands of years later it would become one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history. But sometimes history is shaped not by what people intend, but by what survives. And Tutankhamun's tomb survived. Hidden beneath desert sands for more than 3,000 years. Until one day in 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter opened a sealed doorway inside Egypt's Valley of the Kings. Behind that door waited something almost unbelievable. A nearly intact royal tomb. Filled with gold. Jewelry. furniture, chariots, and the famous golden mask that would eventually become one of the most recognizable artifacts in the world. The discovery transformed Tutankhamun from a relatively obscure young king into an international legend. But the story of strange and controversial Egyptian rulers doesn't end there. Because Egypt's long history produced many more fascinating figures. Some ruled wisely. Some ruled strangely. And some left behind stories so unusual that historians are still debating them thousands of years later. So as the night continues and the Nile keeps flowing quietly through the desert, we move forward into the next part of Egypt's long royal story. As the centuries of Egyptian history drift slowly forward, something becomes very clear. Absolute power is a strange environment for a human being. Most people spend their lives surrounded by limits. Parents set rules. Teachers correct mistakes. Bosses expect results. But pharaohs lived in a completely different reality. From the moment they took the throne, they were told something extraordinary. They were not simply rulers. They were divine. A living bridge between the world of gods and the world of humans. Their words carried the weight of cosmic order. Their actions were believed to influence the balance of the universe itself. Now imagine growing up inside that belief system. Imagine hearing, every day, that your decisions shape the destiny of an entire civilization. Some kings handled that responsibility carefully. Others became a little more experimental with their authority. And one of the most fascinating examples of royal ambition appeared during the reign of Ramesses III. Ramesses III ruled during a time when Egypt was still powerful but facing increasing pressure from outside forces. Foreign groups, often called the Sea Peoples, threatened parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Trade networks shifted. Political alliances grew complicated. In response, Ramesses III tried to project strength. He built temples. He carved dramatic battle scenes into massive stone walls. These reliefs showed the king defeating enemies with effortless confidence, arrows flying, chariots racing across the battlefield. The message was clear. Egypt remained strong. The gods still supported the pharaoh. But behind the polished public image, the palace itself contained tensions that would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic conspiracies in Egyptian history. Because somewhere inside the royal household, a group of individuals began planning something extremely dangerous. They planned to remove the king. Historians call this event the Harem Conspiracy. And the details survive thanks to a collection of ancient court documents describing the trial that followed. According to these records, several palace officials, servants, and even one of the king's wives participated in the plot. Their goal was simple. Place a different prince on the throne. Royal politics could be brutal, even in a civilization famous for its stable traditions. Multiple wives meant multiple sons. Multiple sons meant multiple potential heirs. And when the question of succession became uncertain, ambition sometimes turned into conspiracy. The court records described secret messages, hidden alliances, and attempts to gather magical support for the rebellion. Yes, magical support. Ancient Egyptians believed strongly in the power of spells, curses, and ritual objects. Some conspirators reportedly used wax figurines and magical texts in an attempt to weaken the king's protection. Eventually, however, the plot was discovered. A massive trial followed. Dozens of people were accused. Some were executed. Others were forced to take their own lives. And for centuries historians debated the most important question of all. Did the conspirators succeed? Did Ramesses III actually die as a result of the plot? For a long time, no one knew. Ancient records were vague. But modern science eventually offered a clue. When researchers examined the mummy believed to belong to Ramesses III, they discovered something shocking. A deep wound across the throat. A wound that would have been fatal. In other words, the conspiracy may have worked. Even a pharaoh, protected by divine symbolism, palace guards, and centuries of tradition, was not completely immune to the ambitions of those closest to him. And stories like that remind us of something important about ancient Egypt. It was a civilization of incredible stability. But it was still a society made of human beings. Human beings with rivalries, ambitions, jealousies, and occasionally, very bold plans. Now while some pharaohs faced danger from within their own households, others struggled with challenges that came from their own personalities. One ruler whose story often sparks curiosity among historians is Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III ruled during one of Egypt's most prosperous periods. Trade flowed along the Nile and across the Mediterranean. Foreign kingdoms sent gifts and diplomatic letters. Gold from Nubia filled royal treasuries. It was, in many ways, a golden age. But prosperity can sometimes lead to a different kind of royal behavior. When a kingdom becomes wealthy and secure, rulers often turn their attention toward luxury. And Amenhotep III appears to have enjoyed the finer things in life. His palace complexes were enormous. His celebrations were elaborate. One of the most famous events of his reign was the Hebsed festival, a traditional ceremony meant to renew the king's power. Normally this festival was celebrated after 30 years of rule. Amenhotep III celebrated several of them. Each festival included grand processions, offerings to the gods, and massive public celebrations. Temples glowed with fresh decorations. Statues were commissioned in astonishing numbers. In fact, Amenhotep III ordered so many statues that modern archaeologists are still discovering them today. Two of the most famous are the massive seated figures known as the Colossi of Memnon. Each statue rises more than 18 meters tall. Imagine approaching them as an ancient traveler. Two gigantic stone kings watching silently over the desert plain. A reminder that the ruler of Egypt commanded resources beyond ordinary imagination. Yet historians sometimes wonder whether the extraordinary comfort of this era contributed to the unusual religious revolution that would later appear during the reign of his son, Akhenaten. When a society grows extremely wealthy, new ideas often emerge. Philosophical ideas, religious experiments, artistic changes. And perhaps, somewhere inside the palace of Amenhotep III, the seeds of Akhenaten's future transformation were quietly forming. Because history rarely moves in sudden, isolated moments. It moves like the Nile. Slowly. Gradually. Carrying influences from one generation to the next. And by the time the next generation rises to power, those influences can reshape an entire civilization. As the night continues and the desert winds move softly across the ancient monuments, we find ourselves drifting deeper into the long story of Egypt's rulers. Some remembered for wisdom. Some remembered for ambition. And some remembered because their lives left historians with questions that still echo thousands of years later. Questions about power. About tradition. And about what happens when a single individual is given authority that stretches as far as the horizon itself. By the time Egypt entered the later periods of its long history, the world beyond the Nile Valley was becoming increasingly busy. New kingdoms rose across the Near East. Trade routes expanded across deserts and seas. Empires appeared, grew powerful, and sometimes collapsed just as quickly. For most of its earlier history, Egypt had existed in a relatively comfortable position. Protected by deserts, organized around the steady rhythm of the Nile, and governed by a tradition of divine kingship that gave the pharaoh enormous authority. But eventually the outside world began knocking more loudly on Egypt's door. Foreign rulers grew curious about Egypt's wealth. Allies wanted trade. Rivals wanted influence. And sometimes they wanted the throne itself. Which brings us to one of the most dramatic figures in Egyptian history. A ruler whose life blended politics, intelligence, and spectacle so effectively that her story has been told and retold for more than 2,000 years. Her name was Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra is often remembered mainly through popular stories of romance and intrigue. But the reality of her life was far more complex. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek ruling family that controlled Egypt after the empire of Alexander the Great fractured following his death. By the time Cleopatra was born, Egypt had already been ruled by this dynasty for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies maintained Egyptian traditions, presented themselves as pharaohs, and built temples honoring ancient gods. But culturally they remained connected to the Greek world. This created a fascinating blend of identities. Greek rulers governing an Egyptian civilization thousands of years older than their dynasty. Cleopatra herself stood out even among the Ptolemies. Unlike many of her ancestors, she learned the Egyptian language. In fact, historical sources suggest she spoke several languages fluently. That ability alone would have made her an unusually skilled diplomat in a world where communication between cultures could be complicated. But Cleopatra inherited a political situation that was far from stable. The Ptolemaic dynasty had developed a reputation for intense family rivalries. Brothers fought brothers. Sisters fought sisters. Co-rulers were sometimes forced into uneasy alliances that did not always last long. When Cleopatra first became queen, she technically ruled alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. In theory they governed together. In reality the arrangement quickly became a power struggle. Advisors and court factions formed around each sibling. Political tension grew. And eventually Cleopatra was forced to leave Alexandria for a period of time. But Cleopatra was not the type of ruler who quietly accepted exile. Instead she began preparing a return. And that return would involve one of the most famous figures in Roman history. Julius Caesar. At this point, Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Its armies had expanded far beyond Italy. Its politics influenced kingdoms across the region. And when Roman leaders became involved in Egyptian affairs, the stakes became extremely high. According to ancient writers, Cleopatra managed to arrange a secret meeting with Caesar inside the royal palace at Alexandria. The details of this meeting became legendary. One famous version of the story claims she had herself wrapped inside a carpet or linen bundle so that palace guards could carry her past her enemies unnoticed. Whether the story happened exactly that way is difficult to prove. Ancient historians sometimes enjoyed dramatic storytelling. But what we do know is that Cleopatra succeeded in gaining Caesar's support. With Roman backing, she regained the throne. And for a time, Egypt became closely connected to the ambitions of the Roman Republic. Cleopatra later formed another famous alliance with Mark Antony, one of Rome's most powerful leaders after Caesar's assassination. Their partnership was both political and personal. Together they attempted to build a powerful Eastern alliance capable of competing with their rival in Rome, Augustus, who was known earlier as Octavian. The conflict between these figures eventually led to one of the most decisive battles of the ancient world, the naval confrontation at the Battle of Actium. When Antony and Cleopatra's forces were defeated, the future of Egypt changed forever. Shortly afterward, both rulers died, and Egypt was absorbed into the growing Roman Empire. With that moment, more than 3,000 years of pharaonic rule came to an end. And yet Cleopatra's story did not fade. If anything, it grew larger with time. Roman writers described her as brilliant, dangerous, seductive, manipulative, and charismatic. Later generations turned her life into plays, paintings, novels, and films. Her image shifted depending on who was telling the story. But behind all the myths remained something simple and remarkable. Cleopatra was the final ruler of one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. And she ruled during a moment when that civilization was finally meeting a world that had grown too large to ignore. When we step back and look at the entire timeline of ancient Egypt, from the earliest dynasties to Cleopatra's final reign, a pattern slowly appears. Pharaohs were not identical. They were not interchangeable statues carved into stone. They were individuals. Some were cautious. Some were visionary. Some were deeply traditional. Others experimented with religion, art, or politics in ways that shocked their contemporaries. Rulers like Akhenaten changed how gods were worshipped. Kings like Ramesses II filled the landscape with monuments and enormous families. Long-lived rulers like Pepi II demonstrated how time itself could transform a reign into legend. Queens like Hatshepsut quietly reshaped expectations of power. And figures like Cleopatra guided Egypt through its final encounter with the expanding Roman world. Each one left behind fragments. Temples. Statues. Inscriptions. Stories carved into stone or written onto papyrus. And thousands of years later, those fragments still allow us to listen, very quietly, to the echoes of a civilization that once believed its rulers were living gods. A civilization where the sun rose over pyramids, temples shimmered with gold, and the Nile continued flowing steadily through the desert. Just as it always had. And when we look back across the entire stretch of ancient Egyptian history, something quietly fascinating begins to appear. Despite thousands of years separating one ruler from another, the same basic idea kept repeating itself. Egypt believed in order. In Egyptian thought, this order had a name, Ma'at. Ma'at represented balance. Truth. Harmony between gods, nature, and human society. And according to Egyptian belief, the pharaoh had one central responsibility above all others. Maintain Ma'at. Keep the universe stable. Ensure the Nile flooded at the right time. Ensure temples received offerings. Ensure chaos stayed far away from the borders of Egypt. On paper, that responsibility sounded simple. But in reality it placed enormous pressure on every ruler who wore the crown. Because when things went wrong, when harvests failed, when enemies attacked, when political tensions grew, the pharaoh was expected to fix it. After all, a living god should be able to maintain cosmic balance. And sometimes, when that balance started to wobble, rulers turned toward dramatic solutions. One interesting example comes from the reign of Akhenaten, whose religious reforms we discussed earlier. Even centuries after his death, Egyptians remembered his reign as deeply unsettling. Later generations actually tried to erase him from official records. His monuments were dismantled. His statues were smashed. His name was removed from king lists. Historians even gave him a nickname, the Heretic King. This attempt at historical erasure tells us something important. Egyptian society valued continuity. Change was acceptable when it happened slowly. But radical transformation, especially in religion, felt dangerous. Imagine living in a civilization where the gods have been worshipped the same way for nearly 2,000 years. Then suddenly a king announces that the entire system needs to be replaced. Temples close. Priests lose influence. New rituals appear. That kind of shift would feel enormous. And when Akhenaten's successors restored the traditional gods, they did so very carefully, almost like repairing a damaged piece of architecture. They reopened temples. They re-established the old priesthoods. They re-emphasized the importance of familiar deities like Ammonius and Osiris. In other words, they tried to reassure the population that the cosmic balance had returned. But history rarely moves in a perfectly straight line. Even when traditions are restored, the memory of disruption remains. And in Egypt's case, that memory added another layer to the long story of its rulers. Another reminder that pharaohs were powerful, but not immune to controversy. Now while religion and politics shaped much of Egypt's royal history, everyday life in the kingdom continued flowing along the banks of the Nile. Farmers planted crops when the waters receded. Boats carried goods along the river. Merchants traded grain, linen, and gold. And somewhere above all of this activity stood the royal court. A world of palaces, ceremonies, and carefully choreographed rituals designed to reinforce the authority of the king. Many royal ceremonies were elaborate performances. Pharaohs appeared before crowds wearing magnificent crowns. Priests burned incense. Musicians played drums and harps. Offerings were presented to the gods. And carved images of these events were later preserved on temple walls. These carvings served a very specific purpose. They showed future generations that the king had fulfilled his sacred duties. That Ma'at had been maintained. That the gods had been honored properly. But sometimes, if you look closely at these scenes, you can sense something quietly human behind the symbolism. Because beneath the crowns and divine titles stood individuals with personalities, ambitions, fears, and desires. Kings who celebrated victories. Kings who worried about rivals. Kings who wanted to be remembered. And perhaps that desire, to be remembered, explains why so many pharaohs built such enormous monuments. Stone lasts longer than memory. A temple carved into a cliff can outlive an entire civilization. A statue placed beside the Nile might still be standing thousands of years after the sculptor who created it has been forgotten. Take the monuments of Ramesses II for example. He filled Egypt with statues of himself. Massive seated figures. Towering temple facades. Reliefs showing his victories in battle. Some historians joke that if Ramesses had discovered social media, he would have posted constantly. But in the ancient world, monuments were the closest equivalent. Each statue was a statement. Each temple wall was a permanent announcement of royal achievement. And remarkably, many of those announcements still survive today. Travelers who visit southern Egypt can still stand before the colossal temples at Abu Simbel. For enormous statues of Ramesses sit carved into the mountain itself. Each figure gazes out across the desert with calm confidence. For ancient Egyptians, scenes like this reinforced the idea that their ruler was almost eternal. A figure whose presence would last forever. Of course, we know now that no human power truly lasts forever. Empires rise. Empires fade. Even the most magnificent temples eventually become ruins. But the story of ancient Egypt still holds a unique place in human history. Because its civilization endured for an incredibly long time. More than 3,000 years. Long enough for hundreds of rulers to come and go. Long enough for traditions to evolve slowly across countless generations. And long enough for the lives of its most unusual kings and queens to become legends. Tonight we've wandered through just a few of those stories. We've met rulers who reshaped religion. Rulers who filled the land with monuments. Rulers whose reigns lasted so long they became myths. And rulers whose personal choices stirred whispers throughout palace corridors. Each one left behind traces. Carvings in stone. Fragments of papyrus. Ruined temples rising quietly above desert sands. And as modern historians, archaeologists, and curious listeners continue exploring those traces, the voices of ancient Egypt remain surprisingly close. A reminder that history is never completely silent. It simply waits for someone to listen carefully enough. And somewhere along the Nile, as the desert wind moves softly across the ruins of forgotten temples, the long story of Egypt's pharaohs continues to echo, across the centuries. And when the last echoes of pharaonic rule faded into the expanding power of Rome, the temples of Egypt did not suddenly fall silent. Life along the Nile continued much as it always had. Farmers still watched the river carefully, waiting for the yearly flood that would spread rich black soil across the fields. Boats still drifted between villages carrying grain, pottery, and bundles of linen. Priests still lit incense in temples whose foundations had been laid centuries earlier. But something subtle had changed. For thousands of years Egyptians had believed that their king stood at the center of the universe's balance. The pharaoh was not just a political leader. He, or occasionally she, was a living connection between humanity and the divine. A guardian of cosmic order. A figure responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the sacred balance that kept the world functioning properly. With the arrival of Roman rule, that idea slowly began to shift. Roman emperors technically adopted the titles of Egyptian pharaohs. Their names appeared in temple inscriptions. Priests performed rituals in their honor. But these emperors rarely lived in Egypt itself. They ruled from far away, governing a vast empire that stretched across continents. And so the intimate connection between king and land gradually faded. Yet the memory of Egypt's ancient rulers remained powerful. Stories about great pharaohs continued circulating among travelers, scholars, and storytellers. Greek and Roman writers recorded tales about Egypt's strange customs, massive pyramids, and mysterious gods. Some of these writers tried to understand the culture seriously. Others exaggerated details to entertain their readers. But nearly all of them agreed on one thing. Egypt felt ancient, even to them. When visitors from the Mediterranean world arrived in Egypt during the Roman era, they were already stepping into a civilization that had been old for thousands of years. The pyramids at Giza Pyramid Complex were already more than 2,000 years old. Think about that for a moment. To Cleopatra and the Romans, the pyramids were already ancient monuments from a distant past. They were the equivalent of medieval castles to us today. Perhaps even older. And like modern visitors standing before historic ruins, people of the ancient world felt a mixture of curiosity and awe when they saw them. Who had built these structures? How had they moved such enormous stones? What kind of kings commanded this level of effort from an entire society? Questions like these circulated even in antiquity. Because the farther a civilization moves from its origins, the more mysterious those origins begin to feel. And Egypt's origins stretched very far back indeed. Modern archaeology has helped answer many of those questions. Researchers study inscriptions carved into temple walls. They analyze fragments of papyrus preserved in dry desert tombs. They examine the remains of ancient cities buried beneath layers of sand. Through careful work, historians have slowly reconstructed the long chain of rulers who governed Egypt across millennia. Some of those rulers remain famous today. Names like Ramesses II appear in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits around the world. Others are remembered mainly by specialists who study ancient inscriptions. But each pharaoh, famous or obscure, once lived in the same remarkable environment. A narrow green ribbon of fertile land surrounded by desert. A river that defined the rhythm of life. A culture that believed the gods were deeply involved in human affairs. And perhaps most fascinating of all, a political system that lasted far longer than most civilizations ever manage. Many kingdoms in history survive for a few centuries. Empires rise quickly, expand dramatically, and then fragment under pressure. Egypt was different. It endured. Dynasty after dynasty. Century after century. Even when foreign rulers arrived, they often adopted Egyptian traditions rather than replacing them entirely. Persian kings styled themselves as pharaohs. Greek rulers built temples to Egyptian gods. Roman emperors allowed ancient rituals to continue. It was as if the cultural gravity of Egypt was simply too strong to ignore. And at the center of that gravity stood the figure of the pharaoh. Sometimes wise. Sometimes controversial. Sometimes mysterious. But always powerful enough to shape the direction of an entire civilization. When we look back now, thousands of years later, it is easy to focus only on the largest monuments. The pyramids. The temples. The colossal statues staring calmly across the desert. But those structures were not built by abstract civilizations. They were built by people. Workers who cut stone blocks under the hot Egyptian sun. Artists who carefully painted walls with scenes of gods and kings. Priests who memorized rituals passed down through generations. And rulers whose decisions, good or bad, guided the entire system. Some pharaohs ruled quietly and efficiently, leaving behind stable governments and prosperous economies. Others stirred controversy through bold reforms, unusual personal habits, or dramatic political choices. And those controversial figures are often the ones history remembers most clearly. Because humans are naturally drawn to stories of conflict, change, and unexpected behavior. We remember the king who rewrote religion. The queen who claimed the throne in a world that expected male rulers. The emperor who built monuments so large that they still dominate the landscape today. And the final queen who stood at the crossroads between ancient civilization and the expanding power of Rome. All of them part of the long, winding story of Egypt. A story carved into stone temples, whispered through ancient texts, and rediscovered slowly by archaeologists brushing sand away from forgotten ruins. And as the Nile continues flowing quietly beneath the desert sky, just as it has for thousands of years, the legacy of those rulers remains surprisingly alive. Not as living gods anymore, but as echoes of human ambition, curiosity, and imagination stretching across one of the longest histories any civilization has ever known. And if you were to travel slowly along the Nile today, drifting past quiet villages and palm-lined riverbanks, you would occasionally see something rising above the landscape that feels almost unreal. Fragments of enormous stone walls. Half-buried statues emerging from the sand. Columns that once supported temple roofs now open to the sky. These ruins are reminders of a civilization that invested extraordinary effort into permanence. Ancient Egyptians built with the future in mind. Temples were designed to last not just decades, but thousands of years. Stone blocks were cut carefully and fitted together with astonishing precision. Hieroglyphs were carved deep into the surface so that wind and sand would take centuries to erase them. Every carving, every statue, every monument carried a message forward through time. A message saying, "This king ruled here." Many of those kings hoped that message would last forever. And in a way, it did. Because even now, historians and archaeologists continue piecing together their stories from fragments scattered across the desert. Some discoveries happen in dramatic moments. A sealed tomb suddenly opened. A golden mask uncovered beneath layers of cloth. A hidden chamber revealed behind a temple wall. One of the most famous examples remains the discovery connected to Tutankhamun. When the archaeologist Howard Carter peered into the tomb chamber in 1922, he reportedly saw something astonishing. Golden objects everywhere. Furniture shaped like animals. Chariots carefully stored for the king's journey into the afterlife. And a burial mask so beautiful that it would eventually become one of the most recognizable artifacts in the world. For historians, moments like that feel almost magical. A direct connection between the present and a civilization that existed more than 3,000 years earlier. But archaeology is usually much slower than that. Most discoveries happen quietly. Researchers carefully brush away layers of dust. They record inscriptions. They analyze broken pottery, food remains, and fragments of tools. These small clues gradually reveal how people actually lived. And what those clues show is something fascinating. Despite the enormous power of pharaohs, everyday Egyptian life often remained remarkably stable across centuries. Farmers still followed the rhythm of the Nile's flooding. Craftsmen still shaped pottery and jewelry using techniques passed down through generations. Children still played in the streets of towns built from mud brick houses. Life continued. Even while kings rose and fell. Even while dynasties shifted. Even while political drama unfolded in distant palace halls. That stability may be one of the reasons Egyptian civilization lasted so long. Its foundations rested not only on powerful rulers but also on a deeply rooted cultural system. Religion, agriculture, language, and tradition created a structure that could absorb change without completely collapsing. So when a controversial pharaoh appeared, someone like Akhenaten, the system bent, adapted, and eventually returned to its familiar patterns. When ambitious builders like Ramesses II filled the land with monuments, the population incorporated those projects into their everyday world. And when dramatic figures like Cleopatra guided Egypt through its final political struggles, ordinary life along the Nile continued moving forward. History often focuses on extraordinary individuals. But civilizations survive because millions of ordinary lives continue functioning around them. Still, the personalities of Egypt's rulers left unmistakable marks on the landscape. Walk through the temple halls at Karnak Temple Complex and you will see inscriptions from dozens of different pharaohs layered across the walls. Each ruler added something. A column here. A gateway there. A carved relief celebrating a military victory. Over centuries the temple expanded until it became one of the largest religious complexes ever built. Walking through Karnak today feels like walking through a timeline. Each courtyard reflects a different generation of royal ambition. Each statue represents another ruler hoping to secure a place in eternity. And perhaps that desire, to be remembered, was one of the most powerful motivations driving Egypt's kings. Because memory, in Egyptian belief, was closely tied to the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that a person's spirit could continue existing as long as their name was spoken and their image remained intact. Destroy a statue, erase a name, and you risked weakening that eternal presence. That belief explains why later rulers sometimes erased the names of their predecessors. Removing a rival from history was not just political. It was spiritual. An attempt to erase their influence from both the present and the afterlife. Which makes the survival of so many Egyptian monuments even more remarkable. Despite attempts at erasure. Despite invasions and changing dynasties. Despite thousands of years of desert wind and shifting sand. Enough survived for modern researchers to reconstruct the story. A story stretching from the earliest pyramid builders to the final days of the Ptolemaic dynasty. A story filled with powerful personalities, bold experiments, quiet reforms, and occasional moments of scandal that echoed through palace corridors. And as the night grows deeper and the desert cools beneath the stars, the ruins of Egypt's ancient temples stand quietly beneath the same sky that once watched over those rulers. The same stars. The same river. The same endless desert stretching toward the horizon. Only the kings themselves have vanished. Leaving behind stone, stories, and a civilization whose memory continues to drift through history like the slow, steady waters of the Nile. And if we pause for a moment and imagine ourselves standing somewhere along the Nile thousands of years ago, the landscape would feel both familiar and strangely distant. The river would still glide quietly through the valley. Palm trees would still sway gently in the warm breeze. Birds would still circle above the water looking for fish beneath the surface. But rising above that peaceful natural rhythm would be the unmistakable signs of royal ambition. Temple pylons towering like stone mountains. Rows of statues watching silently over sacred courtyards. Obelisks piercing the sky, their polished surfaces once reflecting sunlight so brightly that they could be seen from miles away. These monuments were more than decoration. They were statements. Each stone block carried a message about the authority of the ruler who commissioned it. Take, for example, the towering obelisks erected during the reign of Hatshepsut. These slender monuments, carved from single pieces of granite, were transported hundreds of kilometers from quarries in southern Egypt. Moving one of them required thousands of workers, carefully coordinated teams of engineers, and enormous wooden sledges sliding across specially prepared paths. Why go to such extraordinary effort? Because monuments were a conversation with the future. They were a way for a ruler to say, I was here. I ruled. Remember me. And in Hatshepsut's case, that message carried extra significance. As we mentioned earlier, she ruled in a system traditionally dominated by male kings. Her monuments were not only religious offerings but also political statements. Each statue, each temple wall relief reinforced the image of her authority. Visitors walking through her temple complex at Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut would have seen long rows of identical statues depicting the ruler in the formal pose of a pharaoh. Calm face. Royal headdress. Ceremonial beard. To modern eyes, these details might seem unusual. But for ancient Egyptians, the symbolism mattered more than the literal image. The figure carved into stone was not just a person. It was the embodiment of kingship itself. And that kingship had responsibilities far beyond ordinary governance. One of the most important was maintaining harmony between humans and the gods. Temples across Egypt functioned as centers of this sacred relationship. Priests performed daily rituals inside dark inner chambers where statues of gods were believed to reside. They washed the statues. Dressed them in fine linen. Presented offerings of food, wine, and incense. These rituals were not symbolic in the modern sense. Ancient Egyptians believed the gods genuinely inhabited these sacred spaces. And the pharaoh, as the chief intermediary between gods and humans, ensured that these rituals continued properly. When rulers neglected temple traditions, priests and citizens sometimes worried that cosmic balance might weaken. That fear partly explains the strong reaction to the religious changes introduced by Akhenaten. For generations, Egyptians had trusted their elaborate system of gods to maintain order in the universe. Replacing that system suddenly created deep uncertainty. What if the old gods became angry? What if the Nile stopped flooding? What if chaos returned? These questions may have quietly circulated through temples and marketplaces during Akhenaten's reign. And when later kings restored the traditional religious system, they likely did so partly to calm those fears. History often remembers these moments as political events. But for the people living through them, they were also deeply spiritual experiences. Because religion in ancient Egypt was not separate from daily life. It was woven into everything. The rising of the sun. The flooding of the Nile. The planting of crops. The burial of loved ones. Even the journey into the afterlife was carefully mapped out through sacred texts like the funerary spells preserved in tombs. Pharaohs, of course, prepared extensively for that final journey. Royal tombs were stocked with objects intended to serve the king in eternity. Furniture, clothing, weapons, food, and small statues known as Ashapti figures, which were believed to perform labor on behalf of the king in the afterlife. When archaeologists explore royal burial sites today, they often discover hundreds of these small figurines placed neatly in boxes. Each one carved with tiny hieroglyphic spells. Each one waiting patiently for instructions that would never come. Perhaps the most famous burial complex lies beneath the desert hills of the Valley of the Kings. Hidden within this rocky landscape are dozens of tombs carved deep into the stone. Each tomb once sealed carefully to protect the body and treasures of a pharaoh. Over the centuries many of them were looted. Gold and precious stones disappeared into the hands of thieves long before modern archaeologists arrived. But even when treasures were gone, the tomb walls still told stories. Painted scenes showed the king traveling through the underworld. Meeting strange deities. Passing trials that would eventually lead to rebirth alongside the rising sun. These images reveal something deeply human about ancient Egyptian rulers. Despite their immense power in life, they still shared the same ultimate concern as everyone else. What happens after death? Their elaborate burial preparations were attempts to answer that question. To secure safety in a mysterious world beyond the horizon. And perhaps that concern, the universal human curiosity about what lies beyond life, helps explain why the history of Egypt continues to fascinate people today. Because behind the gold masks, the colossal statues, and the divine titles were individuals facing the same mysteries that humans still wonder about today. Kings who built monuments hoping their names would last forever. Queens who navigated complicated political landscapes. Priests who studied the movements of stars and the cycles of the river. And ordinary citizens who trusted that their civilization, guided by powerful rulers and protective gods, would endure far into the future. For thousands of years, that belief seemed completely justified. Egypt did endure. Dynasty after dynasty. Century after century. Until finally the winds of global change carried the ancient world into a new era. But even now, long after the last pharaoh ruled along the Nile, their stories remain carved into the stones they left behind. Waiting quietly beneath the desert sun. Waiting for curious minds to read them again. And as the centuries quietly unfolded along the Nile, something almost poetic happened. The monuments built by Egypt's rulers slowly became part of the landscape itself. Stone temples weathered by desert winds began to blend into the cliffs behind them. Statues lost their noses and softened under centuries of sandstorms. Painted wall scenes faded gently, their colors becoming whispers of the vibrant images that once filled entire temple halls. Yet even in this softened state, the ruins continued to communicate something powerful. They told visitors that an extraordinary civilization had once flourished here. A civilization where rulers commanded enormous resources. Where religion shaped nearly every aspect of life. And where the idea of kingship carried cosmic significance. But history rarely remains still. Long after the last native pharaoh ruled Egypt, travelers from distant lands continued arriving along the Nile. Some came as traders. Some as conquerors. Others simply came out of curiosity. Among them were scholars from the Greek world who attempted to document the customs and traditions of this ancient land. One of the most famous was Herodotus. Writing in the 5th century BCE, Herodotus traveled through Egypt and recorded many observations about its culture. Some of his descriptions were surprisingly accurate. Others were exaggerated or based on stories told by local guides. But his writings played an important role in introducing Egypt to readers across the Mediterranean world. He described towering pyramids, sacred animals, strange rituals that seemed mysterious to foreign visitors, and kings whose authority appeared almost supernatural. To Greek audiences, Egypt seemed both fascinating and slightly bewildering. A place where priests preserved ancient knowledge, where temples contained hidden chambers, where monuments from distant centuries still dominated the horizon. And in many ways, that impression was correct. Because Egypt's cultural memory stretched far deeper into the past than most other civilizations known to those Greek travelers. Even Egyptian priests themselves sometimes referred to rulers who had lived thousands of years earlier. Their temple archives contained king lists stretching back through long dynasties. Each name representing another chapter in a story that had already lasted longer than most human institutions ever managed to survive. Those lists included famous figures like Ramesses II. But they also included dozens of lesser-known rulers whose names rarely appear in modern discussions. Kings who governed quietly. Kings who repaired temples. Kings who simply kept the machinery of government functioning for another generation. History tends to remember the dramatic personalities. The controversial ones. The builders of massive monuments. But civilizations endure largely because of quieter periods of stability. Years when crops grow successfully. Trade flows smoothly. And the system continues operating without dramatic disruption. Egypt experienced many such periods. Which is why its culture survived for so long. Yet even the most stable civilization cannot remain unchanged forever. Gradually the Mediterranean world grew more interconnected. Powerful empires expanded across regions that had once been isolated from one another. Armies marched across deserts. Naval fleets controlled sea routes. Diplomatic alliances linked distant kingdoms together. Egypt found itself increasingly drawn into this wider network of political competition. Sometimes it resisted foreign influence successfully. Other times it adapted. Foreign rulers occasionally took control of Egypt but adopted its traditions in order to legitimize their authority. Persian kings styled themselves as pharaohs when governing the region. Greek rulers built temples honoring Egyptian gods. Even Roman emperors allowed ancient rituals to continue within temple complexes. In other words, Egypt's cultural identity proved remarkably resilient. The language of hieroglyphs continued appearing on monuments for centuries. Priests still performed rituals inside sacred sanctuaries. Pilgrims visited ancient temples seeking blessings from familiar deities. Yet slowly, over time, the world outside Egypt changed faster than the traditions within it. New religions spread across the Mediterranean. New political systems replaced older dynasties. And eventually the temples themselves began losing their central role in everyday life. Some were abandoned. Others were converted into different types of religious buildings. Many simply stood quietly while sand and wind gradually reshaped their surroundings. But even in their silent state, these temples continued preserving something extraordinary. Memory. Because every column carved with hieroglyphs. Every statue placed in a courtyard. Every tomb painted with scenes of the afterlife preserved pieces of Egypt's long story. A story filled with rulers whose personalities sometimes surprised their own society. Pharaohs like Akhenaten who challenged religious tradition. Builders like Ramesses II who covered the land with monuments celebrating their power. Strategic rulers like Cleopatra who navigated dangerous political alliances during the final days of Egyptian independence. Each one left behind traces that historians continue studying today. And perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this long history is simply how long it lasted. From the earliest pyramid builders to the final queens of the Ptolemaic dynasty, ancient Egyptian civilization endured for more than 3,000 years. To put that into perspective, that means Egypt's dynastic history was already ancient when the Roman Empire was still in its infancy. It had already witnessed dozens of cultural shifts, hundreds of rulers, countless temple ceremonies, and millions of ordinary lives lived quietly along the banks of the Nile. So as the desert night settles across those ancient ruins today, the temples and statues remain where they have stood for millennia. Silent. Patient. Watching the river continue its endless journey toward the sea. And somewhere within those weathered stones, the stories of Egypt's most controversial, ambitious, and fascinating rulers continue to echo softly across time. And if we imagine the Nile Valley during one of those quiet evenings thousands of years ago, the air would slowly cool as the sun disappeared behind the desert cliffs. The heat of the day would fade. Farmers would finish their work in the fields. Boats returning from trade journeys would tie themselves to wooden docks along the riverbanks. Smoke from cooking fires would rise gently into the darkening sky. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of temple drums or ritual chants might drift across the water. Ancient Egypt was not always dramatic. Most days were simple, predictable, comfortably familiar. But the presence of the pharaoh, somewhere beyond the villages, somewhere within palace walls or temple courts, was always felt. Even when the king was not physically present, his authority shaped the world around him. Taxes were collected in his name. Temples offered prayers on his behalf. Military forces protected the borders under his command. In theory, the king existed everywhere at once through the machinery of the state. Yet the real person behind the crown lived a much more private life inside royal residences. These palaces were busy places. Servants moved constantly through long corridors carrying food, clothing, and ceremonial objects. Scribes sat quietly recording administrative details on papyrus scrolls. Officials arrived to deliver reports about harvests, trade caravans, or diplomatic messages from foreign rulers. And somewhere among all this activity, the pharaoh himself carried out the daily rituals expected of a divine ruler. Some of those rituals were surprisingly personal. Early each morning, priests would awaken the statue of a god within a temple sanctuary. The statue was washed, dressed in clean linen, presented with offerings of bread, fruit, wine, and incense. Symbolically, the pharaoh was responsible for performing this service. In practice, priests handled most of the daily ceremonies, but they did so in the king's name. This arrangement reinforced the idea that the pharaoh maintained direct communication with the gods. And because religion in ancient Egypt was deeply tied to political authority, maintaining that relationship was essential. A king who honored the gods properly strengthened his legitimacy. A king who ignored religious traditions risked losing the trust of both priests and citizens. This delicate balance explains why some rulers who experimented with religious reform faced strong resistance. The most famous example remains Akhenaten. His attempt to elevate the sun disk Aten above all other gods disrupted centuries of established tradition. Temples dedicated to familiar deities lost influence. Priests who had served powerful cults suddenly found themselves pushed aside. And ordinary Egyptians may have wondered what this sudden change meant for the spiritual stability of their world. When later rulers restored the traditional system, they did so with careful attention. Temples honoring gods such as Ammonius and Osiris reopened. Priests resumed their rituals. Festivals returned to their familiar rhythms. It was almost as if the civilization itself exhaled in relief. Because continuity mattered deeply in Egyptian culture. Traditions were not simply habits. They were believed to maintain cosmic harmony. Yet even in a society that valued stability, ambitious rulers still found ways to leave personal marks on history. Some did it through religion. Others through architecture. One of the most spectacular examples of architectural ambition belongs to Ramesses II. His reign produced monuments across nearly every region of Egypt. Temple walls celebrated his victories in battle. Statues depicted him seated calmly with hands resting on his knees, gazing forward with timeless confidence. In southern Egypt, enormous figures of the king were carved directly into a mountainside at the site now known as Abu Simbel. Each statue towers above visitors even today. To ancient travelers approaching the site by boat along the Nile, these colossal figures must have felt almost supernatural. A ruler so powerful that his image had been carved into the very rock of the earth. Monuments like these were more than decoration. They were political communication. Every carving told a story. Every statue reinforced the idea that the king possessed divine authority. And importantly, these monuments lasted. Even after the king himself was gone. Because pharaohs believed deeply in the power of memory. In Egyptian belief, a person's existence in the afterlife depended partly on whether their name and image continued to survive in the world of the living. Destroy a statue, and you risked damaging that person's eternal identity. Erase a name from inscriptions, and you weakened their presence beyond death. This belief explains why some later rulers attempted to erase the memory of their predecessors. Statues were broken. Cartouches, the oval frames containing royal names, were chiseled away from temple walls. Entire monuments were dismantled and reused as building materials. Ironically, these attempts at erasure often made historians even more curious about the forgotten rulers. Because when archaeologists discover a damaged inscription or a statue with its face deliberately destroyed, they immediately begin asking questions. Who was this ruler? Why was their memory targeted? What political or religious conflict led to this destruction? And sometimes, after years of careful study, the answers slowly emerge from the fragments. This process, reconstructing the past from incomplete evidence, is part of what makes the study of ancient Egypt so fascinating. The civilization left behind enormous monuments, yet many of its stories survive only in scattered clues. Broken statues. Half-erased names. Fragments of papyrus preserved by dry desert air. Piece by piece, historians assemble these clues into narratives about the lives of rulers who once believed their authority would last forever. And perhaps that contrast, the temporary nature of human power set against the enduring presence of stone monuments, is one of the most powerful themes in Egypt's long history. Because even the greatest pharaohs eventually vanished. Their palaces disappeared. Their dynasties ended. Their armies faded into memory. Yet the temples, statues, and pyramids they built continue standing beneath the same sky that once watched over their reigns. Quiet reminders of a civilization where kings ruled as living gods, where monuments were built to last for eternity, and where the slow, steady waters of the Nile carried history forward through thousands of years. And if someone living during the height of ancient Egypt had been told that people thousands of years in the future would still talk about their kings, they might not have been surprised. In fact, they probably would have expected it. Because ancient Egyptians believed deeply in the idea that memory was powerful. To be remembered meant to continue existing in some form. A person whose name was spoken, whose statue remained standing, whose story was preserved in carvings or texts, such a person never completely disappeared. This belief influenced nearly every decision a pharaoh made. Monuments were built not only to honor the gods but also to preserve the ruler's identity across time. Temple walls became giant storytelling surfaces where victories, ceremonies, and offerings were carved carefully into stone. These scenes were not random decorations. They were carefully designed narratives meant to explain why a particular king deserved to rule. For example, if you walk through the enormous halls of the Karnak temple complex, you will see reliefs showing different rulers performing rituals before the gods. Each carving follows a familiar pattern. The pharaoh stands tall and calm. The gods face him with approval. Offerings are exchanged. Blessings are granted. These scenes communicate a simple message: the king maintains harmony between the human world and the divine. And that harmony, once again, connects back to the ancient concept of Ma'at. Everything in Egyptian society revolved around preserving this balance. If the Nile flooded properly, Ma'at was working. If crops grew well, Ma'at was working. If enemies were defeated and borders remained secure, Ma'at was working. The pharaoh's job was to keep it that way. But maintaining cosmic balance did not always mean avoiding controversy. Some kings believed bold action was necessary to prove their strength. One of the most energetic examples was Thutmose III. Often called one of Egypt's greatest military leaders, Thutmose III spent much of his reign leading campaigns beyond Egypt's traditional borders. His armies marched north into regions that today include parts of Syria and the Levant. Battle scenes carved into temple walls show chariots racing across dusty plains while archers release volleys of arrows toward enemy. Fortifications. These carvings served both as historical records and as propaganda. They reminded visitors that the king possessed the power to defend Egypt against foreign threats. Victories brought wealth. Tribute from conquered regions flowed into royal treasuries. Exotic goods arrived in Egyptian markets: rare woods, precious metals, strange animals from distant lands. All of this reinforced the image of a strong and capable ruler. But military success was only one way for a pharaoh to demonstrate authority. Another was architecture. And few rulers embraced that strategy more enthusiastically than Ramesses II. During his extraordinarily long reign, he commissioned building projects across the entire country. Temples. Statues. Obelisks. Cities. Even today, when archaeologists map ancient Egyptian monuments, Ramesses' name appears again and again. It is almost as if he wanted to leave a signature across the entire landscape. Visitors approaching the temples at Abu Simbel would have encountered one of the most dramatic examples of this ambition. For enormous statues of the king sit carved directly into the cliff face. Each figure towers more than 20 meters high. Their expressions remain calm and composed, gazing across the desert as though watching time itself pass by. When sunlight enters the temple interior on certain days of the year, it illuminates statues deep inside the sanctuary. This alignment was carefully planned. Ancient Egyptian architects possessed a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and seasonal cycles. Their temples often aligned with celestial events, reinforcing the connection between kingship and the cosmic order. And yet, even rulers who built such magnificent monuments could not completely control how history remembered them. Because reputation depends not only on achievements but also on interpretation. Later generations sometimes judged earlier kings differently than their own contemporaries had. Take the example of Akhenaten once again. During his lifetime, he commanded enormous authority. Temples were built for his new religious vision. Artists developed a distinctive style that depicted the royal family in intimate scenes beneath the rays of the Aten sun disk. But after his death, many Egyptians viewed his reforms as deeply disruptive. Later rulers dismantled his temples. His name disappeared from official king lists. His statues were broken. To them, restoring the traditional religious system meant repairing a cosmic imbalance. Yet thousands of years later, modern historians often see Akhenaten differently. Some interpret him as a visionary. Others as a radical reformer whose ideas arrived far too suddenly for his society to accept. And some simply see him as a fascinating example of how personal belief can reshape an entire civilization. This shifting interpretation reminds us that history is never completely fixed. Each generation re-examines the past through its own perspective. New discoveries change old assumptions. Fragments of inscriptions reveal unexpected details. Archaeological sites buried for centuries suddenly emerge from the sand. With every new discovery, the long story of ancient Egypt becomes slightly clearer. Yet it never loses its sense of mystery. Because no matter how much we learn, we are still looking back across thousands of years at a world where kings were believed to be living gods, where temples connected heaven and earth, and where the slow, dependable waters of the Nile carried the life of an entire civilization forward through time. And somewhere in that vast stretch of history, between the earliest pyramid builders and the final days of Egypt's independence, lived the controversial, ambitious, and unforgettable rulers whose stories we have been exploring tonight. Their monuments remain. Their names remain. And as long as people continue reading those names carved into ancient stone, the echoes of their reigns will continue drifting quietly through the long corridors of history. And as the centuries passed along the banks of the Nile, Egypt slowly learned something that every long-lasting civilization eventually discovers. No king, no matter how powerful, remains forever. Even the greatest rulers eventually become names carved in stone. But while their lives were temporary, the systems they created often lasted much longer. Temples continued their rituals. Farmers continued planting along the fertile black soil after the Nile floods. Priests continued studying sacred texts written generations earlier. The rhythm of Egyptian life remained steady. Yet every now and then, a ruler appeared who disrupted that rhythm in ways people could not easily ignore. One such ruler was Hatshepsut. Her story begins in a situation that ancient Egyptians did not fully expect. Because for most of their history, the pharaoh was almost always a man. The language of kingship, the imagery of power, and the rituals of coronation were designed around male rulers. But Hatshepsut managed something unusual. Originally serving as regent for a young heir, she gradually assumed the full authority of Pharaoh herself. And rather than rule quietly from behind palace walls, she embraced the symbolism of kingship completely. Statues began depicting her wearing the royal crown. Temple reliefs showed her performing sacred rituals normally reserved for male rulers. In many carvings, she even appeared with the traditional false beard worn by pharaohs. To modern observers, this might seem strange. But to ancient Egyptians, these images were not about personal identity. They were about maintaining the symbolic structure of kingship. The pharaoh had to appear in certain ways to preserve cosmic order. So Hatshepsut adapted the visual language of power to fit her own rule. And while her reign appears to have been relatively peaceful, she did something equally significant. She built extensively. Her most famous monument stands at Deir el-Bahari. The temple rises in elegant terraces against the cliffs of the western desert. Long colonnades stretch across open courtyards. Carvings on the walls tell stories of trading expeditions to distant lands, including the mysterious region known as Punt. Ships returned from that journey carrying incense trees, exotic animals, rare woods, and precious materials. These goods were presented to the gods as offerings, reinforcing the message that Egypt prospered under her leadership. For many years, Hatshepsut's reign was stable and successful. Yet after her death, something curious happened. Later rulers attempted to erase her memory. Her statues were smashed. Her name was removed from inscriptions. In some temples, her images were replaced with those of male kings. Historians still debate why this happened. Some believe later pharaohs wanted to restore the traditional male line of rulers. Others suggest political rivalries played a role. Whatever the reason, the effort to erase her from history ultimately failed. Because the monuments she built were simply too large to disappear completely. Archaeologists centuries later rediscovered the fragments. Piece by piece, they reconstructed her story. And today, Hatshepsut is remembered as one of the most remarkable rulers of ancient Egypt. Her story also reveals something interesting about power in that civilization. Even within a culture deeply attached to tradition, extraordinary individuals could sometimes reshape expectations. Of course, not every controversial ruler achieved such lasting admiration. Some became famous for very different reasons. Take Pepi II, whose reign stretched across an astonishing number of years. According to many historical estimates, Pepi II may have ruled for more than 90 years. If true, that would make him one of the longest reigning monarchs in human history. Imagine an entire lifetime spent under the authority of a single ruler. Children born during the early years of his reign would grow old while the same king still occupied the throne. At first, this kind of continuity might seem reassuring. Stability can be comforting. But over time, long reigns create unusual political situations. Advisors grow old. Successors wait impatiently. Generations of officials pass through government offices while the same monarch remains in place. In Pepi II's case, historians believe the central authority of the kingdom gradually weakened toward the end of his life. Regional governors gained more independence. Local power structures grew stronger. And when the king eventually died, the transition of authority may have been far less smooth than earlier generations expected. This moment marked the beginning of a period historians call the First Intermediate Period. Central power fragmented. Regional leaders competed for influence. And the once unified kingdom experienced a time of uncertainty. Yet even during these challenging years, Egyptian culture did not disappear. Temples continued their rituals. Artistic traditions persisted. Local rulers built their own monuments and tombs. Life along the Nile continued in its familiar cycles. Eventually, strong leadership returned and the kingdom reunited once again. This resilience, this ability to recover after political disruption, is one of the most impressive qualities of ancient Egyptian civilization. For more than 3,000 years, it endured. Dynasties rose and fell. Capitals moved. Foreign powers occasionally invaded. Yet the cultural identity of Egypt remained remarkably consistent. The same gods were worshipped. The same writing system, known as hieroglyphs, continued to record official events. And the same river, the Nile, continued to provide the lifeblood of the entire civilization. In many ways, the river itself was the true ruler of Egypt. Its annual floods determined the success of harvests. Its waters carried trade and communication between distant cities. Its predictable cycles shaped the agricultural calendar that organized daily life. Pharaohs might claim divine authority. But even they depended on the Nile's cooperation. When the river behaved as expected, prosperity followed. When floods were too weak or too strong, difficulties emerged. This delicate relationship between environment and society reminds us that even powerful civilizations remain connected to natural forces beyond their control. And perhaps that quiet truth, hidden beneath thousands of years of royal monuments and temple inscriptions, is one of the most humbling lessons ancient Egypt leaves behind. Because while kings built statues meant to last forever, it was the simple, steady flow of the Nile that truly sustained their world. And as time moved quietly forward along the Nile, another generation of rulers stepped into the long shadow left by those who came before them. Some inherited stable kingdoms. Others inherited complicated problems. And occasionally, a ruler inherited both power and mystery. One of the most famous examples is Tutankhamun. Today his name is known around the world, yet during his own lifetime he was not considered one of Egypt's most powerful kings. In fact, he came to the throne at a very young age, likely around 9 years old. That meant real political decisions were often made by advisors, generals, and experienced court officials who surrounded him. But Tutankhamun's reign happened at a very important moment in Egyptian history. Because the country was still recovering from the religious upheaval introduced earlier by Akhenaten. The temples dedicated to traditional gods had been weakened. Priests had lost influence. And many Egyptians still felt uneasy about the sudden shift toward the worship of the Aten. So during Tutankhamun's reign, something significant happened. The old religious traditions were restored. Temples dedicated to powerful gods like Ammonius reopened. Priests resumed their rituals. Sacred festivals returned. And the young king's official name was even changed to reflect this restoration. Originally called Tutankhaten, meaning living image of Aten, he became Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Ammonius. This symbolic change signaled that Egypt was returning to the religious traditions it had followed for centuries. Unfortunately, Tutankhamun's life was short. He died while still very young, probably in his late teens. His tomb, located in the famous royal burial ground known as the Valley of the Kings, was prepared quickly and placed among the burial places of much more powerful rulers. For centuries, the tomb remained hidden beneath layers of desert debris. Then, in 1922, something extraordinary happened. A British archaeologist named Howard Carter discovered the entrance to the tomb. When Carter and his team carefully opened the burial chamber, they found something almost unbelievable. Unlike many royal tombs that had been looted in ancient times, this one remained largely intact. Inside were thousands of objects placed there to accompany the king into the afterlife. Golden furniture, jewelry, chariots, ceremonial weapons, and most famously, the stunning golden burial mask that covered the young king's face. This discovery transformed Tutankhamun into one of the most famous pharaohs in modern history. Ironically, a king who ruled only briefly became one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. Yet Tutankhamun's story also reveals something deeper about Egyptian beliefs. The enormous effort placed into preparing tombs shows how seriously Egyptians took the idea of the afterlife. Death was not considered the end. Instead, it was a transition. A journey into another realm where the soul continued to exist. To ensure that journey went smoothly, the dead were carefully prepared through a process known as mummification. Priests performed rituals designed to preserve the body. Internal organs were removed and placed into special containers. The body was wrapped in linen bandages. Protective amulets were placed among the wrappings. And spells from sacred texts guided the soul through the challenges of the afterlife. Among the most important of these texts was the Book of the Dead. This collection of spells and prayers was designed to help the deceased navigate the spiritual world. One of the most famous scenes described in these texts involves the weighing of the heart. In this symbolic judgment, the heart of the deceased was placed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light and pure, the soul could continue into the peaceful afterlife. But if it was heavy with wrongdoing, the soul faced a very different fate. This belief system influenced how Egyptians lived their daily lives. Moral behavior mattered. Honesty mattered. Respect for the gods mattered. Because one day, every person, king or farmer, would face that same cosmic judgment. Even pharaohs, despite their divine status during life, prepared carefully for this moment. Their tombs were filled with objects meant to provide comfort in eternity. Food, furniture, games, clothing. Even small statues known as Shabti figures, designed to perform labor in the afterlife on behalf of the deceased. The goal was simple. Ensure that life after death would be as stable and comfortable as possible. And so, beneath the desert cliffs where royal tombs were hidden, a silent city of the dead slowly grew over centuries. Each burial chamber carefully sealed. Each corridor painted with scenes of gods, stars, and sacred journeys. Each tomb representing a final attempt by a ruler to control their destiny beyond the limits of mortal life. Above ground, the world continued to change. New kings ruled. New temples were built. New stories unfolded along the Nile. But beneath the sands, those ancient rulers rested quietly. Surrounded by the treasures and symbols they believed would guide them safely into eternity. And as the moon rose over the desert and the cool night air settled across the valley, the silent tombs waited patiently, guarding their secrets through thousands of years of history. And while the tombs of the pharaohs rested quietly beneath desert cliffs, life above the sands continued with the same gentle rhythm that had defined Egypt for thousands of years. The Nile still flowed northward, just as it always had. Villages still gathered along its banks. Fields of wheat and barley still stretched across the fertile floodplains after each annual inundation. To the ordinary people of Egypt, farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and traders, the distant dramas of royal courts often mattered less than the steady cycles of nature. Yet even for them, the presence of the pharaoh remained an important part of daily life. Because the king was not only a political ruler. He was also a sacred figure within the religious structure of the kingdom. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh served as the living representative of the gods on earth. When a new ruler ascended the throne, ceremonies reinforced this idea in powerful symbolic ways. During coronation rituals, the king was presented with royal regalia that connected him to divine authority. One of the most recognizable symbols was the double crown of Egypt, representing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Another symbol was the crook and flail, objects originally associated with shepherds but later adopted as emblems of kingship. These symbols appeared constantly in royal art. Statues. Temple carvings. Reliefs along palace walls. Each image reminded viewers that the king stood at the center of the cosmic order. But kingship also carried enormous responsibilities. A pharaoh was expected to protect the land, maintain justice, support temples, and ensure that the gods received proper offerings. If harvests failed or disasters struck, people sometimes wondered whether the king had lost the favor of the gods. For this reason, pharaohs invested heavily in religious buildings. Temples were not simply places of worship. They were also economic centers. Large temple complexes employed hundreds of workers, priests, scribes, farmers, artisans, and laborers. Land was owned by temples. Livestock was managed by temple administrators. Grain storage facilities ensured that offerings and resources remained available throughout the year. One of the most magnificent temple complexes ever constructed in ancient Egypt was the Luxor Temple. Located along the east bank of the Nile, this temple played a central role in an annual festival known as the Opet Festival. During this celebration, statues of the gods were carried in ceremonial processions between Luxor Temple and the massive sanctuary at Karnak Temple Complex. Crowds gathered along the route to watch the procession. Music filled the streets. Priests performed sacred rituals. And the pharaoh himself sometimes participated in ceremonies symbolizing the renewal of his divine power. Festivals like this served several purposes. They honored the gods. They reinforced the legitimacy of the king. And they brought communities together in shared celebration. For ordinary Egyptians, these events may have been some of the most exciting days of the year. Colorful banners waved in the wind. Incense drifted through temple courtyards. Musicians played drums and flutes. And the towering statues of the gods, carried on decorated barges, moved slowly through the crowds. In these moments, the distance between divine and human worlds felt smaller. But not every ruler relied solely on festivals and ceremonies to maintain authority. Some used diplomacy. Others used military strength. And a few used careful political strategy. One fascinating example is Amenhotep III. His reign occurred during a period of great prosperity for Egypt. International trade flourished. Foreign rulers exchanged gifts with the Egyptian court. Diplomatic marriages connected royal families across distant regions. Letters discovered in archaeological archives show that kings from other lands addressed the Egyptian pharaoh almost as an equal partner in global politics. These letters, written on clay tablets, reveal an ancient world surprisingly connected through trade and diplomacy. Gold from Egypt was particularly valuable. Foreign rulers often requested it in large quantities. In return, they offered luxury goods, horses, precious stones, and exotic animals. Within Egypt itself, Amenhotep III oversaw an impressive period of artistic and architectural development. Among his most famous monuments are the towering statues known today as the Colossi of Memnon. These enormous stone figures once stood at the entrance of his mortuary temple. Each statue rises nearly 18 meters high. They depict the king seated calmly on his throne, gazing out across the Nile Valley. For ancient visitors, these statues must have felt overwhelming in scale. They served as a reminder that the pharaoh's presence extended far beyond the limits of his lifetime. Yet even these colossal monuments could not completely protect a ruler from the passage of time. Wind slowly eroded their surfaces. Earthquakes damaged parts of the structures. Sand drifted across their bases. Nature, patient and persistent, gradually reshaped the landscape around them. Still, the statues endured. And as travelers from later civilizations passed by, Greeks, Romans, and eventually modern explorers, they wondered about the rulers who had built such extraordinary monuments. In this way, the pharaohs achieved something remarkable. Long after their voices fell silent, their images continued speaking. Through carved stone. Through temple walls. Through the quiet ruins scattered across the desert. Each monument became a message sent forward through history. A message saying, simply, that once upon a time a king ruled here, believed himself chosen by the gods, and built something he hoped would last forever. And in many cases, it did. And as the long history of Egypt continued unfolding along the Nile, another type of ruler began to appear in the historical record. Not always the loud conquerors or the builders of massive monuments. But kings who ruled through patience, diplomacy, and quiet authority. One such ruler was Seti I. Seti I inherited a kingdom that had already begun restoring stability after the religious upheavals of earlier generations. His goal was not to completely reinvent Egypt. Instead, he focused on strengthening traditions that had already proven successful. Temples were repaired. Sacred rituals were carefully maintained. And perhaps most importantly, Egypt's borders were defended through military campaigns designed to maintain control over important trade routes. These campaigns took Egyptian armies north into territories where powerful city-states competed for influence. Scenes carved on temple walls show chariots racing forward while soldiers advance in carefully organized formations. But unlike some rulers who celebrated war purely for glory, Seti I seemed focused on restoring order rather than expanding endlessly. His reign helped stabilize the kingdom, preparing the way for the long and energetic rule of his son, Ramesses II. Yet even while powerful rulers commanded armies and built monuments, the everyday life of Egypt continued quietly in the background. Imagine a typical village near the river. Mud brick houses arranged in narrow rows. Children running through dusty pathways. Farmers returning from the fields with tools balanced over their shoulders. Inside small homes, families prepared evening meals made from bread, vegetables, and fish caught from the Nile. The scent of cooking fires drifted slowly into the cooling air. Life here followed a schedule shaped almost entirely by the river. Each year the Nile flooded, spreading nutrient-rich soil across the surrounding land. After the waters receded, farmers planted crops. Months later, harvests filled storage granaries that would sustain communities until the next flood. This cycle remained remarkably consistent for thousands of years. And because the river's behavior was usually predictable, Egyptian civilization developed a sense of stability that many neighboring regions lacked. Yet the Egyptians did not simply trust the river blindly. They watched it carefully. Priests and officials monitored water levels using structures known as nilometers. These measuring points helped determine whether the coming harvest would be abundant or difficult. If the floodwaters were too low, crops might struggle. If they were too high, villages could suffer damage. Understanding these patterns allowed officials to prepare grain storage and manage resources across the kingdom. In many ways, this system helped Egypt become one of the most organized societies of the ancient world. Behind the visible monuments and royal ceremonies existed a massive administrative structure. Scribes recorded taxes. Officials tracked harvests. Messengers carried information between cities. At the center of this system stood the pharaoh, supported by a network of advisors and administrators who ensured the kingdom continued functioning smoothly. One of the most powerful figures within this system was often the vizier. The vizier served as the king's chief administrator, overseeing legal matters, construction projects, agricultural planning, and communication between different regions of the kingdom. Think of the vizier as something like a prime minister. While the king represented divine authority, the vizier managed many of the practical details that kept the country operating day after day. And this brings us to an interesting truth about ancient Egypt. Although pharaohs were celebrated as divine rulers, their success depended heavily on the competence of the people around them. Priests maintained religious traditions. Architects designed temples and monuments. Engineers organized massive construction projects. Artists carved intricate scenes into stone. Without these thousands of skilled individuals, even the most powerful king could accomplish very little. One of the most famous groups of workers lived in a special village known today as Deir el-Medina. This settlement housed the artisans responsible for decorating the royal tombs in the nearby Valley of the Kings. Unlike ordinary laborers, these workers were highly trained specialists. They carved delicate reliefs, painted vivid murals, and wrote detailed inscriptions describing the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Because their work was so important, and because they knew the secret locations of royal tombs, they lived in a carefully organized community under close supervision. Archaeological discoveries from this village reveal something fascinating. The workers left behind personal letters, drawings, and notes about everyday life. Through these documents we glimpse a surprisingly human world. People argued with neighbors. They worried about wages. They complained when food supplies arrived late. In fact, one of the earliest recorded labor strikes in history may have occurred among these workers when rations were delayed. Instead of continuing work on royal tombs, they simply stopped. They sat down and refused to resume until officials addressed their concerns. It is a reminder that even within a society ruled by divine kings, ordinary people still had voices and expectations. They understood the value of their skills. And sometimes, they used that knowledge to demand fair treatment. These small moments of everyday life balance the grand stories of kings and temples. Because civilizations are not built only by rulers. They are built by communities. Farmers planting seeds. Artisans carving stone. Scribes patiently copying texts. Together, these countless individuals created the world we now call ancient Egypt.